Good evening, and welcome to the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. I'm Jan Schall, Sandra Soslin Curator of Modern Art, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Michael Neiberg, the award-winning professor, prolific and esteemed scholar, sought-after speaker, recipient of numerous research fellowships and grants, and a valued colleague on the advisory committee for the National World War I Museum at Liberty Memorial here in Kansas City. Dr. Neiberg received his PhD in history from the Carnegie Mellon University in 1996 and is a specialist in military history. His teaching career has taken him from the United States Air Force Academy to the University of Southern Mississippi, where he served as co-director of the Center for the Study of War and Society, and now to the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There, he serves as the Stimson Chair of History and Security Studies. Dr. Neiberg is the author of 18 books, with the 19th forthcoming. His book, Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War I in 1914, was published in 2011 by Harvard University Press, and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best books ever written on World War I. He is the editor of an additional 5 volumes, and the list of his published articles numbers at least 27, probably up from the last time I've checked. We are honored to have Dr. Neiberg with us this evening in conjunction with our recently opened exhibition, World War I and the Rise of Modernism. This exhibition, with its focus on the impact of that war on modernist art and artists, commemorates the centennial of the so-called War to End All Wars. In Kansas City, this collaborative project was initiated by the National World War I Museum, the Kansas City Symphony, the Kansas City Lyric Opera, and the Kansas City Repertory Theater are among our arts and cultural partners. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Neiberg.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jan, and thanks to all of you for braving the polar vortex to come on out here tonight. I want to start by thanking Adam, Jan, Kat, who stood by with a number of flight changes as US Air had different plans for getting me here than we had originally, and thank Laura Vogt, if she's here from the World War I Museum, for suggesting that I be invited to come out here. I've had the great fortune to come out to Kansas City quite a bit in the last couple of years. I love it here. It's a great city, great people. One day I will come out here when the weather is good. That hasn't happened yet. One day it will happen. I want to start with a disclaimer. I am an historian of Europe in the period of the First World War and the Second World War. I am not an historian of modern art. So any questions you may pose to me at the end of this about modern art, I'm going to answer with one word, and that's going to be Jan. What I do want to do here today, however, is try to set a little bit of the historical context of what this war did, of what 1914 in particular did to Europeans, and to a lesser extent to Americans as well, although 1914 has a dramatic impact on the United States as well, of course. And I want to help set up why this lexicon of modernism, why this language of modernism that is so brilliantly and beautifully displayed in the artworks that the Nelson-Atkins has put together in the exhibit upstairs, why that lexicon and that language particularly spoke to the people of this generation. And as that exhibit upstairs will show, modernism predates the First World War. The ideas predate the First World War. The concepts predate the First World War. But as I hope to show you here, the First World War, and specifically how this war began and the events of 1914 in detail, gave a distinctive force and a distinctive energy to modernism, and made it probably the single most important language of interpretation of the First World War leading forward into the 1920s and into the 1930s. And tonight I hope to explain a little bit about why that was. I want to start by noting that the First World War is, in my view at any rate, the single most important event of the early 20th century. Probably the single most important event, at least as what my kids hear me say all the time, the single most important event in all of modern history. It is at the same time an event that we know far too little about. Here in Kansas City, you have wonderful resources for that, but I'm a little bit amazed, of course, as I go around the country talking to folks, how much the Second World War is a part of the American imagination and how little the first is. And it's part of my goal here today to convince you that we need to find some balance in that as well. All right, back to modernism. Modernism questions some fundamental themes of both European and American society. And again, the images upstairs, the paintings upstairs, the wonderful pieces of art upstairs show this brilliantly. Images like parenthood, like the image that I have here, Georges Rouault's War, the Dread of Mothers. And it doesn't take too much imagination to read into this. A woman, not unlike one of the women I'll talk about here in just a little bit, the German artist Katie Kollwitz, trying desperately hard to hold on to her child, perhaps like Katie Kollwitz, having already lost a child to this war. Modernism also questioned other themes. It suggested, even though modernism predated the First World War, it picked up on the suggestion of the German poet Hugo Ball, an idea that also is famous from Paul Fussel's great book, The Great War in Modern Memory. The notion that 1914 to 1918, those 4 years, represents a distinctive break in human history. Fussell argued that the shock of 1914 to 1918 was so great that the very languages that human beings used to communicate had to change because they were insufficient to convey the concepts of what human beings were living through in 1914 and 1918. Hugo Ball in 1917 said something similar. He wrote, "A world has collapsed. There is a time before me and a time after me. Religion, science, morality, phenomena originating in the fear of primitive peoples. An era collapses. A 1,000-year culture collapses. There are no pillars and no supports, no foundations which have not been shattered. Machines were created and took the place of individuals. New battles, new trips to heavens and hells." The notion here being that the world after 1914 can never be the same as the world that occurred before 1914. And for the record, for full disclosure, I agree. Big shock there, huh? And modernism helps to explain this. Modernism helps to give people a voice to think about this. A colleague of mine once said something to me that's always kind of rattled in the back of my mind. He said, at the end of the First World War, people were desperately saying, boy, if we could just rewind the clock to 1914. Whereas in 1945, nobody said, boy, if we could only rewind the clock to 1939. And one important thing to understand is that the world of 1914, the Europe of 1914, and through Europe, the European empires in Africa, in Asia, even into the United States, that world may have been inequitable. That is to say that that world may have had its problems, but that world was fundamentally stable. The people who went to war in 1914 did not imagine in their wildest nightmares that that world was going to go away as completely as it did. The European empires of Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which governed Europe, much of Europe, and by extension much of the rest of the world, utterly disappeared by 1918, meaning that the world would need to get created completely anew. And even though Britain and France emerged from the First World War victorious, they emerged as very different kinds of countries than the ones they had been going in. Several historians, I now count myself among them, although I fought this for a long time, increasingly think of the First and Second World Wars as one conflict, 1914 to 1945. 1914 to 1918 removed monarchy, removed empire in its traditional sense, as the governing system of Europe and through Europe the rest of the world. It left in its wake a competition between democratic capitalism, Bolshevism, and fascism to see what would replace it. That dynamic, of course, does not end until 1945. Several of my academic colleagues would argue that that dynamic doesn't end until 1989, when the Soviet Empire finally comes apart, and several of my Middle Eastern colleagues will argue it hasn't come apart yet. One of my colleagues at the War College and I have jokingly started to call what's going on in the Middle East today the War of the Ottoman Succession, and although that's a tongue-in-cheek phrase, there's a lot of truth behind the argument that what's happening in the Middle East today is a century of trying to figure out what will replace the Ottoman Empire, which in 1914, even though called the sick man of Europe, nevertheless nobody expected to see go away as completely as it did. So this idea of a very sharp break occurs in modernism as well. Erich Heckel's Two Soldiers, the image that you see here, questioning the relationship of people to one another. This image, the greatest mother in the world, picking up on Michelangelo's beautiful Pietà, looking at the relationship of motherhood, the relationship of the state the relationship of society, the relationship of individuals to one another, community, science, progress, government, all have new meanings and new connotations in the post-war world. They all have new understandings. They all come with new associations. And of course, the main theme of modernism, at least the one that shocks me so much, is the theme of sacrifice and suffering. And here is Katie Kollwitz's self-portrait. I'll talk about her a little bit more. I'll talk about this in a little bit. She created one of the most, in my view at any rate, dramatic pieces of art ever to come out of the First World War. This one isn't it, although it could well be. This is her self-portrait. Katie Kollwitz, as I'll talk about in a little bit, lost one son to this war and tried desperately to hold on to her other son. The First World War brought a quest to assign meaning to that suffering and meaning to that sacrifice. And it's my own personal view, although I have no evidence to sustain it, that it is exactly that quest in the 1920s and 1930s that creates the instability of what the French call les années noires, the dark years. How can France justify the loss of 1.2 million of its sons? The reconquest of Alsace and Lorraine will not do it. Thus does the war dominate the work of artists like Kollwitz. To what purpose was it all? And perhaps most importantly, where will humanity go from here? Now, the standard historical explanations, in my view, don't help us a heck of a lot to answer this question. There are two ways that we have traditionally understood the First World War, and I'm going to reject both of them here. The first is a diplomatic explanation, trying to figure out who was responsible for the First World War. And here I've given you just 4 examples. The most famous is probably the one on the left, the 1961 book by the German historian Fritz Fischer, Germany's Aims in the First World War. Better in the German translates literally to Germany's Bid for World Power, which will give you an idea of Fischer's thesis. Fischer argued in 1961 doing something that every scholar should hope to do, creating a line of debate that continues well beyond his death, that Germany had been planning this war for decades, that this had been part of a grand German quest for world power. More recently, Sean McMeekin has made a similar argument about the Russians, if a bit perhaps more nuanced. Sean argues that what Russia did in the diplomatic crisis of 1914 is take advantage of the diplomatic crisis, to push the British and French to accept traditional Russian war aims, including control of the Dardanelles and control of Poland. Jeff Warrow has made the case to blame Austria, specifically the Hungarian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Neil Ferguson, in my view, the least convincing of the 4 books up here, tried to blame Great Britain about 20 years ago, in an argument that to me simply doesn't make any sense. The problem with these arguments is, A, they are largely intended to assign blame, which doesn't really help to explain modernism for us. It doesn't help us to explain the post-war world. And B, the very people that brought Europe to war in 1914, almost none of them are in power in 1918. There is, in effect, nobody to blame. The Tsar is, of course, dead. Kaiser Wilhelm is in exile. Herbert Asquith had long been voted out of office in Great Britain, and the same thing is true of the French government, where the socialist premier who began the war, René Viviani, the French go through several premiers until they finally settle on Georges Clemenceau, who is the prime minister who takes France to victory. None of those people from 1914 is still around in 1918. The same can be said, by the way, of the military leadership of Europe in 1914, with one very interesting exception, but I won't go into that here because I don't think it has much to do with modernism. Thus, the diplomatic explanations, while interesting, while insightful in many ways, fail really to help us understand the Europe of the post-war period. And I would argue they fail utterly for the Europeans of this time period. That is, it does not matter much to a French, British, German, Italian, Russian which diplomat said what to whom. There is a second way, and those of you who have heard me speak before, and a few of you unfortunates are in the audience tonight, have heard me go after this. The way we've taught the First World War, the way I learned the First World War, the way I taught the First World War when I was short on time, is through something called the main method of history, looking at militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The essential argument runs something like this. In 1871, these big bad Germans here, starring Otto von Bismarck in the white, defeat France in war. They come here to the Hall of Mirrors, in the Palace of Versailles. They create a new nation state of Germany in the center of Europe, and the rest of the period from 1870 to 1914 is an effort by the other states of Europe, specifically France, to destroy this state or to enact some measure of revenge. The problem, as those of you who've heard me speak on this before, is that it's totally wrong. I could go into this, but I won't. I'll be happy to in the Q&A if you'd like. Neither militarism, nor alliances, nor imperialism, nor nationalism causes Europe to go to war in 1914. If anything, Europeans from 1911 to 1914 thought that their world was getting better. They thought that these factors in European history were becoming far less important, not far more. And as I hope to show you here, part of the reason that modernism is so attractive to Europeans in the post-war period is the unbelievable psychological shock that they go through in 1914 when their society actually does go to war over a cause as stupid as the death of a nobleman in a place most of them couldn't find on a map. In 1914, Europeans believed their world was getting better. The other reason why this explanation makes no sense to me is that the fundamental cause of this war is not Alsace-Lorraine. It is not a naval rivalry between Britain and Germany. It is, of course, a Balkan event. What that means is that the great powers are not acting so much as they are reacting to a crisis that is unfolding around them. By all rights, if any war should have come from the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it should have been the Third Balkan War, not the First World War. This, in part, I think, helps to explain why we continue to look for diplomatic explanations. Who screwed this up so badly that Europe went from a minor crisis to a European war and then to a global war? The structural explanation has a nice narrative to it. That is, it can begin and end in this very room. This is the same room where the Treaty of Versailles is signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. But not only is that misleading, as most of my historian colleagues will tell you, it privileges the French, British, and German experiences of this war. For most people around the world, not including the United States, the war doesn't end, simply because the French, British, and Germans agree to have it end. The First World War releases a whole series of smaller conflicts. The war that breaks out in 1939 to 1945, by this reckoning, isn't something radically new. It isn't something that deserves its own name. It is simply the largest of these aftershocks of the First World War. So, if I'm going to reject those two explanations and I'm going to connect it back to modernism, we have to look at something else. And the first thing to look at is what Europeans were actually thinking, saying, and doing in 1914 when this man and his wife were assassinated. And some of you may know the story. This is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is heir to the throne of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. His great uncle, Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, has been on the throne since 1848. He's not in great health. It is expected that he will give the throne to Franz Ferdinand at some point in the near future. Franz Ferdinand has some very interesting ideas for the Austro-Hungarian Empire that make him a very unpopular figure. Essentially, what he would like to do is take the Austro-Hungarian Empire and make it an Austro-Hungarian Slav Empire. Jeff Warrow, in the book that I mentioned earlier, argues that this is the real problem because it means that Hungary will go from 1 in 2 votes in the empire to 1 in 3. He goes to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. It is the day of St. Vitus's Day. It's a holy day for Serbs. They see this as a provocation, and they decide to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. 100 years on, we still don't know, with any clear evidence, with any clear definitiveness, whether officials in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were acting as part of a global plot, as a government plot, or whether they were more or less acting as rogue agents on their own. Nevertheless, his assassination becomes what we would today call an act of state-sponsored terrorism. The important thing, though, in my mind, is to look at what Europeans actually were saying in 1914. If you teach this method of the war, which again, to my shame, I have done when I've had 20 minutes to explain it, you argue that Europe is a place of white-hot tensions just waiting for something to blow it all up. And it is the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand that provides that spark. Virtually every textbook on World War I will say this, because it's the easiest way to explain an unbelievably complicated event. Instead, you see things like this. Stefan Zweig, whose work I was very happy to see come back into the limelight a little bit with the new Wes Anderson movie, The Grand Budapest Hotel. It's based on Stefan Zweig's writing. He wrote, "Only a few weeks more, and the name and figure of Franz Ferdinand would have disappeared for all time out of history." And I think he was right. If you look at the newspapers of Europe in 1914, this assassination is front-page news for a couple of days, and then it disappears. There is the Irish Home Rule crisis in Great Britain that is occupying people's attention. There's a wave of strikes in Russia, and there's a fascinating murder case on trial in Paris at this moment. The wife of a finance minister shot a newspaper editor dead in his office, said the equivalent of, "I shot him, I'm glad I shot him," and was acquitted. I can tell you that story later if you want. We call what happened in 1914 the July crisis, not the June crisis. And those words are illustrative. It is not the assassination of the Archduke that creates the problem in Europe. It is instead the delivery of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia, which occurred on July 23rd, which I'll talk about in just a bit. And I think the Irish Times was right when it dismissed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as just another tale of blood in the annals of the ill-fated House of Habsburg. This was certainly not the first assassination in the history of Europe. This was certainly not the first political assassination in the history of Europe. And when you read what even Franz Ferdinand's friends said, they said, maybe his assassination will make Europe a calmer place, not a more deadly one. No one, and I think I can say this definitively, no one on June 28th, June 29th, June 30th, 1914, thought that this event would lead to 4 years of war that would topple 4 of the European empires. The German and British navies were in fact getting drunk together at Fleet Week ceremonies at Kiel. They didn't know about it until they woke up the next morning hungover. Winston Churchill, who was at those maneuvers, said it was unimaginable to us that we'd be at war within a month. Again, things seem to be getting better. So to me, it means that there are at least 3 themes that we have to focus on from the beginning, and then I'll explain what Europeans did expect to see. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is the extreme shock that such a minor crisis could lead to a war. H.G. Wells and a friend of his, when they heard about the assassination, H.G. Wells says, "I opened up my atlas to see where Sarajevo was. I didn't think about it again." And it is H.G. Wells who will give us the phrase, "This will be the war to end all war." Second, the tremendous disconnect between the cause and the effect. It's the first thing I think that got me really interested in the First World War. How could something so small, something so insignificant as the assassination of 2 people lead to a war whose effects we continue to feel in our own day? And third, and here's where I think modernism comes in most importantly, the quest for figuring out a meaning to all of this. How do we understand it? What has it done? Europeans expected a crisis out of this, but they expected a crisis kind of like this. And I apologize for all the text here. What I have on the left-hand side of this slide are the 4 major crises that history books will usually point to. More sophisticated ones will treat these in a sophisticated manner. Less sophisticated books will treat these as steps on the road to war. I'd like you to notice 2 things about these crises, please. The first is how long they all go on. In some cases, months. In one case, more than a year, the first Morocco crisis. The second thing I'd like you to note is that none of them resulted in war. In the first case, the Fashoda crisis between Great Britain and France, the diplomatic crisis led not to war, but to an alliance between 2 countries who had hated each other since the time of Shakespeare. The 2 Morocco crises, similarly, had moments of tension and moments of problem, but they both also resolved themselves perfectly peacefully, in large part because the Europeans understood that nobody wanted to go to war over something as insignificant as Morocco. This, by the way, is where the Americans first start to enter the European diplomatic scene. This is where the United States really first begins to make its mark, and the Europeans are not happy about it. So part of the reason the Morocco crisis ends quickly is they want to get the meddling Americans to shut up and go home, at least the second one. It's what puts Elihu Root, the building I work in is named for Elihu Root. It's what puts him on the world scene. It helps him get a Nobel Peace Prize for helping to resolve the second Morocco crisis. The Balkan Wars, 2 wars in 1912 and 1913, are certainly violent for the Balkans. But the great powers of Europe worked together, Britain and Germany working together, to make sure that the violence did not go beyond the Balkans. And then on the right-hand side here, just 2 quotes. I could have picked 5,000, but who wants that? I picked 2, 1 British and 1 French. And what I'd like you to notice is how late in the game they nevertheless have confidence that this is going to work itself out, that the diplomats of Europe are going to figure something out. So you get the Manchester Guardian. Diplomacy will have all the time needed to localize this latest Balkan war where it belongs, in the Balkans. When Europeans talked about the war, They tended to talk about it before August 1914, that is in those brief couple of weeks in late July. They referred to it either as the Austro-Serbian War, or my favorite title, the Danubian War, after the river that goes through both Vienna and Belgrade. The Petite République in late July, we praised the calm attitude of France and Germany, who still watch with folded arms and sword in sheath. And both the French and the German press in late July both said the same thing. This crisis doesn't affect us in the least. Nothing to worry about. So what happened? On July 23rd, the Austrians, for reasons that I can answer in the Q&A if you want, but I'll give you a little taste of it now, decide that the stars are not going to line up this well again for them in any future crisis. They are the victims of this act of state-sponsored terrorism. That means the great powers of Europe have to give them some room to maneuver that they did not give them in past crises. They also believe that Russia, of all countries, cannot possibly stand up for state-sponsored terrorism. The Russians, of all people, want to stop anybody from shooting at kings. That means the Russians should stand on the sidelines. And specifically because this crisis affects neither France nor Britain, those two countries ought to stay on the sidelines too, and Italy, by the way, meaning that Austria will have room for maneuver that they cannot count on in any future crisis. And I'd like you to note a couple of things about that ultimatum. The first is that the Austrians intentionally speed up that timetable. Rather than the months that the Morocco crises took, Austria gives Serbia 48 hours to respond, intentionally speeding up the timetable. And the second thing, as I like to tell my students, my undergraduates, when I taught undergraduates, the ultimatum and the Serbian response to it are both written in French. The Treaty of Versailles is written in English and translated into French. There's something important going on there too. On July 26, Serbia responds in very elegant diplomatic French. It's the best language for diplomacy because it gives you a lot of room for nuance, a lot of subjunctive voices, more or less accepting every condition of the ultimatum except one, which they say will be willing to talk to you about. Not good enough for Austria, and Austria declares war on Serbia. On July 27th, however, Russia, France, Italy, and Germany all accepted arbitration in principle. This is Elihu Root's great contribution to international diplomacy. The idea being that either two countries, Austria and Serbia, will submit their cases to a neutral power, probably Great Britain, maybe the United States, and agree to abide by whatever that arbiter says. The arbiter, in turn, agrees not to take anything for itself. July 28th, I mentioned this, the International Socialist meeting in Brussels, on the same day that Austria declares war on Serbia. What I found interesting about this, the socialists of all people in Europe were the ones most interested in preventing wars. They were the ones most interested in making sure that some small thing like Morocco didn't become a world war, didn't become a continental war, what they would have called a general war. On July 28th, there is a pre-scheduled International Socialist meeting in Brussels, and they don't talk about the crisis at all. They say, if there's still a crisis in late August when we meet in Vienna, we'll talk about it then. They don't think this is happening. And you can see Edith Wharton, the famous American writer who was in Paris on July 31st, by which time the key decisions for war have already been made. And you can see what she says here. Of course there couldn't be war. So one thing to look at here is the speed of the events, how fast things are happening. It's possible in a time when many Europeans read 2 or 3 newspapers a day to read in morning newspapers that the crisis looks bad, and then read in afternoon papers, no, everything is fine. It's possible to read in the afternoon newspapers, the French president and the German ambassador are talking, everything's okay. It's possible to read the telegrams that Wilhelm and Nicholas, the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia, the so-called Willy-Nicky telegrams, Europeans could read those in their newspapers, and they're very positive. They say that they're going to work together for peace. So, when this war actually does begin, 2 things are going to happen. The first is, the people of Europe are going to support the wars, not enthusiastically. Enthusiasm is the wrong word. The word that I would use is duty or determination. Because, they will argue, that their country didn't start it. The same thing, by the way, will happen in the United States. When we finally enter the war in 1917, Americans will say, and they will say it with conviction, and I think they will say it correctly, they are being dragged into a war they did not begin. And what I've done here on the next 2 slides is take a look at a French and a German saying almost the same thing on almost the same day. There is in our souls the clear certitude that France did not want this war. She had hoped for peace until the last minute and had worked for peace. And by the way, I agree with that sentiment, which is why in the earlier slide I showed you of the diplomatic people who get blamed for the war, there is no book written about France, nor is there one about the United States. And in this week, especially with what's going on in France, my Francophile tendencies tend to show, but I tell my students, France is the one country in 1914 that is involved in this war for the most noble and the most just reason of all. Another country invades their soil. And again, the Germans make the same argument, and I can talk about this. It's complicated, what the German elite is thinking and what the German people are thinking. One thing can be said of the German people with absolute certainty: we didn't want a war and we have done everything in our power to prevent it. Now that cannot be said of the German elite. It can, however, be said of many people inside Germany. And again, that's important because of what happens in that Hall of Mirrors in Versailles on June 28, 1919, when the German people are forced to accept sole and lone guilt for the outbreak of the war. Germans will point to the last bullet on that slide, the mobilization of the Russian army on July 30th, which allows the German government to mobilize its army while simultaneously making the argument that the main reason they're going to war is to protect the German people from the Cossacks of the Tsar. The second theme is this war of self-defense that you see come up over and over and over and over again in 1940. Nobody, in the research for that book that Jan was kind enough to mention, nobody said, "Thank God this war has started, I've always wanted to shoot a German." This is what they say instead. And the one on the right is the one that I like the best. Le Bonnet Rouge was as far left as it was possible to get in France. Le Bonnet Rouge was the newspaper who said, if France goes to war over Morocco, we will go on strike and shut the entire country down. Le Bonnet Rouge is the newspaper that said, the flag of France is only fit to place atop a dung heap. Here's what it said in August 1914. France did not want this war. The government resolutely affirmed its specific intents. If by some calamity someone wishes to perpetuate this most monstrous crime against civilization, all Frenchmen will know how to do their duty. Because we didn't start this one. Gustave Hervé, the editor of this newspaper, the man who wrote the dunghill line, said, although I am an old man, if my country needs me, I will put my rifle on my shoulder and I will march. Because France didn't start this one. Back to Katie Kollwitz. This is the piece of art that I was mentioning. This is the sculpture that she was asked to design by the German government for the cemetery where her son is buried. Rather than come up with something triumphant, she came up with this. It is not a sculpture of a soldier at all. It is a sculpture of two parents mourning over the grave of their own son. Rudyard Kipling wrote something that reflects this same sentiment. He wrote the classic lines, if any ask us why we died, say because our parents lied. The sense of guilt that the parents survived, another thing that Fussell argues radically changes the way Europeans think about the world. Sons are supposed to outlive their parents, not the other way around. And in the Europe of the post-war period, they're doing it in the millions. Katie Kollwitz wrote a letter to her sister in late September of 1914 that I think describes an awful lot of what it is that broke Europe, a lot of what it was that led to some of the things that she was later going to be an important part of. She wrote this, and I apologize for reading it out to you. She wrote, one cannot hold on to any illusions anymore. Nothing is real but the frightfulness of this state which we almost grow used to. In such times it seems so stupid that the boys must go to war. The whole thing is so ghastly and insane. Occasionally comes the foolish thought, how can they possibly take part in such madness? What Katie Kollwitz has realized very early on, and she's not the only one, if Germany went to war ostensibly to protect itself against the Russians, it was nevertheless true that 7 of Germany's 8 field armies invaded Belgium and France. That's the frightfulness of the state that she has to grow used to. What she is aware of is whatever set of lies, whatever set of falsehoods dragged Germany into war in 1914. It makes no sense to argue about them now, which is why the letter ends with these words, but they must. Katie Kollwitz figured out by September of 1914 something that I think many statesmen didn't figure out for a couple more years. This war had become a total war, even if nobody could figure out exactly what this war was about. By September 1914, nobody was talking about avenging Franz Ferdinand. Nobody was talking about fixing the border between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. This war had become a total war that could result only in a total peace. And I put this up here partly for my fellow World War I historians who have taken to calling, I think it's done now, but used to call 1916 the year when total war began, the so-called year of the big battles. As Katie Kovacs has shown, it's in place by 1914. For France, it's absolutely in place by 1914. At the French Military Academy at Saint-Cyr, on the walls where they list those young men who graduated from Saint-Cyr who have died for their country, there is a plaque that simply reads, "The Class of 1914." And those of you who have been to France will know, every town, every village, every canton, no matter how small, has a memorial to the dead of World War I. Some of these towns are so small. There's one in Normandy that I always take students to when we go to the D-Day beaches. It's just behind the D-Day beaches. It has a town hall, a cafe, a church, and a school. The monument to the dead has 17 names on it. 3 last names. So what? The first thing I think we have to understand, Europeans were not eager for this war. It hit them like a massive psychological shock. They understood from the very first days of this war that the world would never be the same. The bloodiest year of the bloodiest month of the war for France is the first month of the war. It's August 1914. France has to deal with that level of trauma that quickly. Observers in France, and I have a couple in the book, who were in France for Christmas 1914 already observed it. One American who was in Paris in 1914 said that Christmas time in France in 1914 could be summed up in 3 words: women in mourning. And again, nobody expected this. Second, all sides saw this war in defensive and moral terms. George and I were talking in the hall about a colleague of ours, Len Smith, a wonderful human being and a fantastic scholar. Len talks about the First World War, the people of Europe, as giving what he calls a dual consent. The first is the consent to go to war, which is based on this notion of defense. The second is the consent to keep fighting. And Len argues, and I would absolutely agree with him, those societies that cannot sustain what I call the myths of 1914 are precisely those societies that come apart by 1918. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Those states that are able to sustain those myths, that are able to sustain the belief of defensive war, are the countries that stay together. Most notably, of course, England and France. They are also not coincidentally democratic societies. Third, World War I, in my view, was the cause, not the effect, of nationalist hatreds. By which I mean, in 1914, plenty of Europeans saw themselves in national terms, but they did not understand that nationalism as requiring them to hate or kill people across a border. What 1914 did is create enough hatreds in Europe to fuel the First World War, fascism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, World War II, not one Holocaust but 2, and some scholars would argue a Cold War. Those embers don't cool until 1989. World War I caused that. It is not the effect of that. What does that mean? Well, it means, in my view, that profound psychological shock to Europe required, as Paul Fussell argued, a new language, a new way of thinking about the world. For Paul Fussell, that came in the written words that people used, creating a new language to explain and describe what they were witnessing. The modern artists that are in the galleries upstairs are doing the same thing with their paintbrushes, with their new mediums, with their new ideas. How to explain the world, how to explain the fragmenting, the fracturing, the hopeless disintegration that Europeans watched for 4 long, bloody years, and then to watch the peace process come apart as well, to get to a point where all of that fighting, all of that killing, produces a peace treaty that even the people who wrote it knew would not last. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, said upon leaving Versailles, "It is such a pity we're going to have to do this all over again in 25 years. Ferdinand Foch, that one general who's in command in 1914 and 1918, Foch refused to go to the signing ceremony because he hated the treaty so much. and he said the prophetic words, "This is not peace, this is an armistice for 20 years." He wrote that in June 1919. He was off by 3 months. Without the First World War and the hatreds that it laid bare, it's hard for me to see how modernism could have become the force that it became, or how a painting like this one could have ended up in a museum in Kansas City. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can. Sir. Yeah.
Why couldn't they stop this quick run of war? Was it these forces that overtook them?
So the question is, if the royal families of Europe, and this is true for Britain, France, and Russia, Britain, Germany, and Russia. France, of course, didn't have a king. Those three states, all of those royals were cousins. So why didn't the family connections stop this war? My first answer to that from my own family experience is just because you have first cousins doesn't mean you're on speaking terms. More importantly, however, and less smart alecky, what you realize very quickly in looking at 1914 is how unbelievably out of touch these royals were. In Great Britain, in Germany, in Russia, even in the democracies, what strikes me, and it's something at the Army War College that I'm so intent on talking with my students about, the politicians and the military people do not have sustained communication between one another. The Kaiser had no idea what his own army's war plan was designed to do. Neither did the Tsar. Neither did the Prime Minister of France. They had no idea. What quickly becomes apparent in the Tsar's case and in the Kaiser's case is that these guys are completely irrelevant. They don't know what's going on. They don't understand the system. They like to wear uniforms. They like to march around like they're in charge, but they don't have any idea what's going on. And the Kaiser very famously, when the crisis comes, he says, look, the crisis is in the east, General Moltke. Moltke was the head of the German army. His uncle was the legendary Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. This is Moltke in this painting right here, standing next to Bismarck. And the Kaiser says, look, rotate everything to the east. There's no threat in the west. And Moltke says, Your Majesty, we've been writing a war plan for 15 years that says we go west no matter what. And the Kaiser looked at him and said, your uncle would have given me a better answer. That's all he can do. So I don't think the royals are particularly relevant in all of this. In fact, I think they're totally irrelevant.
What's your synopsis on the Guns of August?
Barbara Tuchman's book, Guns of August, which helped to really do this royal kind of image. I mean, it's a well-read book, a well-written book. By her own admission, she never looked at primary sources. She never looked at an archive. By her own admission, that's not what she wanted to do. I've looked in a lot of primary sources, and they tell a much more complicated story than the memoirs do. And especially since Barbara Tuchman wrote that book in the early 1960s, French archives have opened, British archives have opened, Russian archives have opened. We know a lot more than we used to know. It's not a book that I recommend to people. It's not even a book that I use anymore as a kind of introduction to the topic. It's older than I am now, and again, it did not look at what we historians do. The best thing maybe that can be said about it is if the anecdote is true, that John Kennedy read it right before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it helped make him go slow. It helped make him realize don't go to military action first.
What's your best book you think on
On the First World War. The camera's rolling. Whatever I say is going to... there is a Scottish-British academic named Hugh Strahan, H-E-W, last name S-T-R-A-C-H-A-N, and I think almost anything that Hugh has written should be your starting point. I think he's done about as good a work as anybody. Christopher Clark's recent books, The Sleepwalkers, has its flaws, but it is also quite good. Those two are works that are deeply grounded in primary sources, in the words and actions of the people of the era. If you have something specific in mind, come see me after and I can give you some recommendations. It's a complicated period in history. What else? Yes, sir.
What was the argument against that kind of the second
So the question is, well, what is the argument that Wilhelm is not responsible for the outbreak of World War I? In my own personal view, the senior leaders of Europe are more guilty of incompetence than they are of design. That is, the Fritz Fischer thesis that the Germans had been trying to do this all along and were only waiting for the opportunity, to me doesn't hold. If anybody deserves the blame for starting this war, in my view, it is a very small group of elites in Austria and in Germany, mostly driven around the Kaiser's retinue, but not around him. My issue with this is that we lump that in as the Germans and the Austrians, which creates a unity between leaders and led that wasn't there in 1914. And again, my book that again, Jan was kind enough to mention, I'm not interested in that diplomatic question at all. If you are, there are books I can point you to. But in my view, and Christopher Clark makes the same point, it's less a question of what people are doing than it is their inability to understand what their actions are leading to. That is the problem. Yes, sir.
When you walk into a classroom and teach the subject, what lessons do you want your students to come away with?
Okay, so as you know, I teach at the Army War College. So I teach American and international lieutenant colonels and colonels. One lesson clearly to me is that there has to be a process by which national strategy, that is, what are, oh, you've asked a very tough question. The war plans of 1914 are operational war plans, by which I mean they're designed to win a campaign. They're not designed to achieve the strategic ends of the state, and that's an enormous problem. In the American military today, as you know better than I do, the system is designed that it begins with the strategic ends of what the state is trying to accomplish, and then the war plan is written from that. This is an argument between two old philosophers, Clausewitz and Jomini. These are Jominian war plans, which means they're meant to win a campaign. So that's the first. The second, on the larger state level, is be sure you really have exhausted all of your options before you go to war. Because once a war like this one especially begins, it can grow out and out and out and out. And the third, always have options. And it is Moltke, it is that guy, who said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Or the other version of the story is, if your enemy only has two options, always expect him to do the third. Yet the war plans that they wrote did not take into account any flexibility whatsoever. The 1914 case is, to me, an example of over-planning and hoping. It's an Army War College phrase that I love. I use it all the time. Hope is not a strategy. Of hoping that when you actually go to war, things are going to lock in the way that you want them to. What I'm most fascinated about, we have officers from 82 countries at the Army War College. And so officers from Senegal, from India, from Jordan, all of whom are deeply affected, many of whom were created by the First World War. And I also want my students to understand those different perspectives of how this war looks from India, because it looks very different than it looks from Kansas City or from London or Paris. Sir?
To what extent were the alliances that were in place, were there used as reasons to go to war, responsible for the First World War?
So the question is about the alliances in this. Those alliances are complicated. The alliances only require states to go to war if one of their allies is attacked. So when the war begins, Italy is the first state that says, look, our ally, Austria-Hungary, is the aggressor. We want no part of this. There is no alliance commitment that brings England to war. There is no alliance commitment, actually, that brings France into war. There is an agreement between France and Russia that they both agree to uphold. That agreement is put in place. It's complicated. The French left does not want an alliance with Russia, the most conservative, retrograde, terrible state in Europe. They accept it only because an alliance with Russia is contingent upon France not being the aggressor. What that means is France cannot start a war to get back Alsace-Lorraine. So the alliances are incredibly complicated. Germany and Austria have a terrible alliance. Again, it's a wonderful story if you ever want to look it up. There is a spy scandal in 1913 where the Germans find out that the head of Austria's counterintelligence division is a spy for Russia. The Germans find out. The Austrians, instead of putting the guy on trial or even interrogating him, leave him in a hotel room with a loaded pistol and tell him to do the right thing. And he does, which means that Germany can now not find out what Austria told Russia. So the Germans respond by breaking off joint staff talks. They're not talking to the Austrians. Erich von Falkenhayn, the Prussian war minister and later commander of the German army, to their faces tells the Austrian general staff, "You are childish military dreamers and wretched people." And he recites Napoleon's great line that the Habsburgs are always one idea, 1 year, and 1 army short. So if this was a war to protect alliances, that's a very funny way to approach a war. There's no joint staff talks at all. And the same thing happens, by the way, once the war begins. The great Battle of Verdun that Falkenhayn launches in February 1916, he doesn't even bother to tell the Austrians about it. They find out when they pick up the newspapers. That's a strange way to run an alliance. It's in the back, sir. You want me to do the rest of the world? Well, the great debate has been, so to pick India, 1.4 million Indians served in World War I with no conscription. More people from India go to the First World War without conscription than any other country, which is mind-blowing. It's probably the last country you would put on there. So for about 80 years or so, 90 years or so, we've been debating why that is. What was it? The same is true of Senegal, by the way, where enormous numbers of Senegalese joined the French army. This student I had from Senegal 2 years ago, his grandfather was a First World War soldier in the French army. The old historiography said, well, they must have been tricked into it or dragooned into it or forced into it. And we don't have a lot of first-person accounts because most of these soldiers didn't leave first-person accounts. A friend of mine in London who researches this, he is himself Indian, showed me one of the few Indian soldier diaries from the First World War. It's about 16 pages filled with profanity that the British taught him. So it's actually rather impressive. 16 pages of Cockney English ways to say nasty things. It's quite impressive. But it's not helpful in trying to understand why these guys did what they did. More current historiography tends to argue that people in Senegal, this was certainly my student's impression of what his grandfather was doing, these people fought because they believed in their connections to the empire. That is, Gandhi supported the First World War. What they could not handle was that the war ended not with higher principles, but it ended with what they saw as extreme hypocrisy. So Wilson's ideas of national self-determination apply in Poland, but they don't apply in Senegal or India, right? And as you might know, 1919 is the date of the Amritsar massacre in northern India, right? That's what turns Gandhi from believing we can work within this empire to no, this empire has got to go. So I think historians now will tend to argue, that in the non-West, people in these empires believed in what they were doing. They quickly became disillusioned by it and became very disillusioned by the end of the war. This is true in French Canada. I just got done reading a dissertation. Next week I have to participate in this dissertation defense in Canada. Most French Canadians took this argument. That is, they felt no attachment to France at all. They felt themselves to be Canadian. But in exchange, they expected some gain for themselves in Canada. The same is true of African Americans in the United States. We'll fight the war despite the segregated nature of our own society, but something has to come out of this. And when something doesn't, that's when the problem becomes. That's about as good as I can do it for you. Ho Chi Minh did the same thing under the name Wen Ai Kwok, supported the French war, encouraged enemies and Indochinese to serve. And then you might know the famous story, whether it's true or not is a matter of conjecture. We do know that Ho Chi Minh went to Paris to talk to Woodrow Wilson and to try to get him to apply national self-determination to Indochina. And the story goes that he knocked on the door of the Hotel Crillon where Wilson was staying and asked to see the president. And the story goes the guy on guard said the servant's entrance is in the back. And Ho Chi Minh left Paris and went to Moscow. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Maybe something. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Can I speak to any similarities in today's world? What I tell my students, I teach an elective on this, and I used to teach it chronologically, and I stopped doing that. So I now organize the lessons of that elective behind everything that the U.S. Army students tend to think they're the first generation ever to have to deal with. So I do a lesson on economic warfare. I do a lesson on non-state actors. I do a lesson on technological change, social change, right? Everything that we tend to think we're the first generation ever to have to deal with, we're not. This era, I did this to an audience once. I said, imagine an era, if you will, of state-sponsored terrorism, rapid technological change, rapid social change, increasing globalization, right? All these things I listed. And of course, they're not 2014, they're 1914, right? 1914 was a more globalized world than the one we have today. People could go from country to country with no passport, no paperwork, no government tracking them, right? It was a completely flattened world, right? And in many ways, the Cold War blinded us to that because it created a very sharply bifurcated world. So somebody asked the question about the alliance. England and Germany are technically in separate alliances. They are each other's biggest trade partners. There's no distinction. There's no problem with that, unlike the Cold War. There were 100,000 Germans living in London when the First World War broke out. Right? So when I teach First World War to my students, getting back to your question, this is what I do. Right? That world is not so different from the world that you're in. It's not my students' fault. I mean, we all tend to think we live in the most complicated times ever in history, and we're the first people ever to have to do this. Right? The people of 1914 were living in a world orders of magnitude more complicated than ours. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's what it is. It's the best I can do. Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any recommendations for books about
The Armistice. The best book, the book that I recommend to everybody, Erez Manela, M-A-N-E-L-A, wrote a brilliant book called The Wilsonian Moment. And what that book is about is people like Ho Chi Minh, I think Korea, Egypt, Kenya. It is about those people around the world who were reading what Woodrow Wilson was saying and who were believing in the American model and who rallied to Wilson and what they did when they realized that Wilson didn't really mean what he said. In Manela's title, that Wilsonian moment was an opportunity for the United States to really show the world this is what we believe in. And it didn't work out quite that way. Margaret Macmillan wrote a history of the Paris Peace Conference that is very well received. I think it's a good narrative history. That is, it's a good way to help people get into this very complicated period in history. She's an excellent writer. And will help get you into that moment. She's also David Lloyd George's great-granddaughter, so she brings that perspective as well. It's kind of funny. David Lloyd George doesn't do anything wrong for the first 200 or so pages of the book. And Lloyd George is, to me, an absolutely fascinating figure. But, yeah. So, I don't know. Should we stop or take more or whatever? If anybody has more questions, I'm happy either to answer them here or after. Or I don't know. I don't want to keep anybody from an evening you may have planned. Yes, sir. Okay, so this is the book I'm working on now, so it is a different lecture. In general, Americans react to the outbreak of the war by trying to either help the people who are suffering or to make money off the war, because the United States economy is in recession when the war begins. The war gets us out of it very quickly. What happens from 1914 to 1917 is that Americans increasingly begin to feel this war as a threat. So, lots of things I could talk about here, but there is a German campaign of terrorism that goes on in the United States, which includes a lot of sabotage. It includes the single greatest terrorist incident in the United States prior to 9/11. It's the blowing up of the Black Tom munitions depot in Jersey City, New Jersey, which almost nobody in America knows anything about, which I'm stunned about. It's a beautiful park. The park is only there because the Germans blew up the railroad depot that was there. And there is one poorly worded, grammatically incorrect sign in the back of the park that tells you what happened there. There's nothing there. I'm serious about that. I've actually contacted the New Jersey State Parks to try to get them to do something else, and they ignored me. And then by the time you get to 1917, with events like the Zimmerman telegram, Americans begin to feel this threat. It is not true that Americans enter the war feeling neutral. Americans side almost exclusively with the British and the French. And one thing that is quite surprising when you look at the primary documents, they are more sympathetic to the French than they are to the British, for all sorts of very interesting reasons. By 1917, the war is no longer that war, it's our war too. And if I had the chart here, I'd put it up. There's a wonderful map that Life magazine did in early 1916. And this is when Pancho Villa is running around claiming that the Germans are paying for him. It depicts a world where Mexico is a German ally, Japan is threatening the West Coast, Turkey has Baja California, I think, Austria is given Florida, and the northern part where Canada is, it just says barbarians. And so I showed this map in Canada at a couple conferences. The point is not that we thought Canadians were barbarians. If Germany wins the war, remember, Canada is British. It means that Germany can take whatever pieces of that it might want. right? So New Zealand is the country that sends the most men per capita to World War I, by far. And the rationale among New Zealand historians is they were aware that if they lost the war, Germany would probably take it as spoils. So in 1916, if you've ever been to the US Virgin Islands, which I haven't yet, but I'm going to write a grant for it, the United States bought the Danish Virgin Islands in 1916 because we were afraid, and the Danes were too, that Germany would go to war with Denmark, invade Denmark, and take the Virgin Islands and build a Navy base that could threaten the Panama Canal, which had just been opened in 1914. Right? From 1914, when the United States thinks this is somebody else's war, to 1917, when we think it could very much be our war. That's the kind of arc of American attitudes. But I got a couple chapters written, but I'm still moving. So when I get it done, I'll, sir. Another easy question. Why have we learned so little from history? I think this is another thing I talk to my students about all the time. It is so much harder to make peace than it is to start a war. It is so much harder to put the pieces of Humpty Dumpty back together again. I mean, we're learning that in the Middle East. It is so much harder to do. Wars create expectations, they create anger, they create new political groups, they create new political regimes. They change an entire world around. And you can't control that. You were talking about Clausewitz and Jomini. I mean, Clausewitz described war as a card game. You know, you sort of know the cards that are in your hand. You have no idea what the cards are the other players at the table, and you certainly don't know what cards are in the deck in front of you. It's so much harder to make peace than it is to go to war. And that's what the men, and they were all men, who went to Paris in 1919, I think it's what they quickly realized. They had broken a system so unbelievably badly that they couldn't put it back together again. Why we don't learn from history? You want my own personal view, it's because we don't particularly care about it. We are happier to tell ourselves a version of history that makes us feel good or makes us feel bad, as the case might be. I wrote this line in a piece that Orbis asked me to write, asking about European responses to the centennial. And I said, if you tell me a person's nationality and their politics, I will tell you who they believe caused the First World War. Because it's not about history. It's about identity and it's about memory. The reason I think we are so careful to split World War I and World War II is because we love to feel so good about World War II. World War I must suffer by contrast. And the easiest way to make that point is to walk down the mall in Washington, D.C. and walk from there is no United States Memorial. There is a Washington, D.C. Memorial that until a couple of years ago was in such bad shape it was at risk of falling over. And then you walk no more than an eighth of a mile, quarter of a mile, and there's that gargantuan World War II thing, which is, in my view, exactly what the Nazis would have built if they'd won. It's a triumphalist. I mean, I hate it. I hate it. And meanwhile, the World War I one is crumbling, literally crumbling, about a quarter of a mile away. That's not a very good answer, but that's a tough question you asked me. Anybody else? One more, maybe? Yes, you're done, or yes, you want one more? Yes, sir. No, hidden history, no. No, is this, so this is my fault. My brain, from all my years of graduate training in history, I can't read like regular books. Like I brought a novel with me to read on the flight home, and I'm going to try, but I don't do it very well anymore.
Apparently, it contends that the powers were planning for a war.
Yeah, so the problem is there's just no evidence to sustain that argument, that the great powers had wanted this war. I mean, all of them respond by saying, look, if country X is going to invade, we will go to war. And once we go to war, we will then figure out what justice is. Because they hadn't thought about it yet. France famously, I mean, if you can look at it, in the July crisis in that moment, France does not mention Alsace-Lorraine, the two provinces that the Germans take away. It's never mentioned, never. Nobody talks about it. And in fact, there is this wonderful set of data that a French historian named Jean-Jacques Becker discovered. In the July crisis, the French government asked school teachers all throughout France to report back what's going on in your home departments. What are people saying? Will they go to war? What are they believing? And what these things show, it's a ridiculous figure. It's like 6% of these reports from these teachers mention Alsace-Lorraine at all. And half of them say that people don't want to go to war for 2 German provinces. Now, once the war begins, that changes. Then Alsace-Lorraine is the way you're going to justify all of this loss and all of this sacrifice. This was something I was particularly looking for when I was working on the Dance of the Furies book, because my wife was a student in Strasbourg for a while. We have friends, we have family in Strasbourg. It was something I was particularly attentive to, because the memory in Alsace is that the Alsatians themselves didn't want to go to war for either side. So the phrase they use is, we were the malgré nous, the despite ourselves. We went despite not wanting to go at all. And that's actually very much the way the French are talking about them. Like, what's the point? Why would we bring them back into our country? They're not really like us. All the French left anyway. David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford, went to Alsace in 1913. And he said, here's what we ought to do. It's not really French and it's not really German. What we ought to do is make Strasbourg the capital of Europe. What we ought to do is put a European capital in this city to show that it belongs to everybody. And he said that in 1913. So this is not a war about Alsace and Lorraine. It's the easiest way to explain it, right? France wants revenge, France wants... So one more anecdote. Many history books will tell you that after this event right here, so if you've been to Paris, on the Place de la Concorde in Paris, there are 6 statues for the 6 great cities of France. One of them is Strasbourg. So history books will tell you, when I'm on a textbook buying committee, as soon as I see this, I throw the book, I actually threw one in the trash. It will say that the French covered the statue of Strasbourg with black mourning crepe, and they didn't lift it up until 1919. The problem is, I found dozens of photographs in the Place de la Concorde in this time period. Not one shows that statue covered in black. Not one. So this gets back to your point. I mean, there's a difference between what we historians call history and memory. Right? This is memory, it's not history. And I'd be happy to answer more questions up here, but that's not a bad place to end. That was pretty eloquent. So thank you very much for your attention.